Okay, so these notes are going to be called data collection and measurement notes. So we've talked about we ask questions, we gather our information, we identify our variables, write our hypothesis. So now we are in the step where we're going to start doing our experiment. That means we have to collect data, and when we collect data, usually we're going to be measuring. So there are some things that I want you to keep in mind. So the first thing is data is always put into a data table. That is super duper important. We don't want to just write measurements down and then when we go back to have to realize, okay, what was that? We have to, figure out what we measured and what it was. So we make a data table, okay? So an example of a data table would be Alright, so let's say that we are going to do an experiment with plants. So we set up our data table. We're going to do 3 trials. Okay, then we're going to find the average. So let's say we're going to do an experiment on plants, okay? Let's say that I have daisies that I am trying to plant. I want to know how much water that a daisy plant needs, okay? So my question would be, what effect does the amount of water have on a daisy? Then my hypothesis would be, if daisies are given different amounts of water, then daisies need 1 cup of water for height to increase. Okay, so let's say I'm going to test, I have 1 cup, 2 cups, and 3 cups. Okay, I've just decided I'm going to test different amounts of water. I'm going to water them on the same day, the same way. I'm going to use the same tool, okay, the same measuring cup. So this up here is where you're going to put your independent variable, okay? Over here is where your trials go, and then in these boxes is where your data is going to go. So what's the outcome that I'm measuring for this experiment that I'm talking about is the plant height. So let's say that I measure with 1 cup the first trial, my measurement would go in this box. Okay, so let's say that I measured and it was 10 centimeters. Okay, it grew 10 centimeters. Well, let's say that when I did the first trial and I put 2 cups, it only grew 5 centimeters. Now this is just an example, okay? So not real data, just an example. Okay, so let's say that when I did 3 cups, it didn't grow that much. It only grew 2 centimeters. Okay, I measured this and wrote it down in my table. It's an organized way to write down your measurements for your dependent variable. Okay, so then I would move on and do my second trial, and then I would do my third trial. Okay, so let's say that the first one, okay, then I have 2 cups. I'm just making up numbers, okay? And let's say that this one went up 14. Okay, I measured these hypothetically. Okay, so I've collected my data. To find the average, you add up, then divide by the number of trials. Okay, so you would add 10, 12, and 14, and then divide that by 3. Okay, so, I'm writing this in here. Okay, 36 divided by 3 is 12. So my average is 12. Okay, so 16 divided by 3. Okay, so when you find the average, you are adding up all the numbers you have. Okay, so that would be 5.3 centimeters. And then you have 5, 6, so 6 divided by 3 is 2. So whenever I go to do my graph, when I get to the analyzing part, instead of graphing all of these numbers, I may only graph the average. So we'll get to that tomorrow, okay? So when you collect data, you put it into a data table. Super duper important. You organize it. You set this up before you do your experiment, okay? Now, let's talk about when you go to measure, things that you need to keep in mind. Okay, I'm going to go to another page, but you don't have to go to another page if you still have room, or you can flip this over to the back of your notebook page, but I just want to have enough space. Okay, so I'm going to make a little chart. All right, so I'm going to look at measurement. Okay, we're going to have a definition. We have units, and we have tools. Alright, so since I'm going to make a chart, I'm going to try to make this nice and neat for you. So I will try to draw straight lines. Alright. Just so we can organize our information a little better. So when you take measurements, when you decide what your dependent variable is going to be, you're going to measure that, okay? So our first measurement that we're going to talk about is length, okay? Or this is also sometimes referred to as distance or height, okay? So this is the distance between 2 points. So like if we were going to measure plant height, we would take our ruler, and we're actually measuring length because we're measuring how high something goes, okay? Now our units in science is we really don't use inches and feet. We use centimeters, meters, and kilometers. Okay, so we use the metric system. Alright, now the tools that we use is we can use a ruler or a meter stick. Okay, so one type of measurement that we would do is length. Okay, so now the next type of measurement that I want to talk about is volume. All right, so we can do length times width times height. You may have seen that before. Okay, so the amount of space an object takes up is volume. Okay, now if we measure volume, we're going to measure it in cubic centimeters. We're going to measure it in cubic meters. Now if we do liquid volume, we use milliliters or liters. So you can use a ruler or a graduated cylinder. So this is one type of data you can collect. That's not very straight, but it's okay. Alright, another piece of data that you can collect is mass. And mass is the amount of matter in an object. Remember, we're collecting data. Okay, so we may change something and we may want to see if the amount of matter in that object has changed. Alright, so the unit we use is grams or kilograms. And we are going to use a triple beam balance or a scale. Okay. Alright, so one of the measurements that we are most used to when it comes to things is weight. So we like to see if the weight changes. That is actually the amount of gravity on an object. So weight and mass on, an object. Okay, so mass and weight get confused a lot. So mass is the amount of matter in an object, and weight is the amount of gravity pulling on that matter. Okay, because gravity pulls. So sometimes we use newtons, but we will use pounds. It's not metric, but we will use it, or ounces in this case. Okay. Alright, so we use a spring scale or a digital scale. Alright, and then the last type of measurement that we would use is temperature. Okay, so temperature, we want to see if something affects the temperature of something else. Alright, it is the average kinetic energy of particles in a substance. I know that sounds crazy because when we think of temperature, we think of how hot or cold something is. But really, everything is made up of particles. So when we measure the temperature, we're measuring the movement of those particles. If it's really, if the temperature is high, that means the movement is high. There's a lot of movement. If the temperature is low, then that means that there's not a lot of movement. Okay? That is the scientific definition of temperature. We are going to use Celsius. We are going to use Fahrenheit. And we are going to use Kelvin. And the tool we use is a thermometer. Alright, so whenever you're thinking of your dependent variables, you're going to think about your dependent variable has to be measured in some way. So are you going to be measuring the distance, or maybe the length of something, or are you going to measure the volume, which is length times width times height? Okay, length times width times height. So that's where the centimeter times centimeter times centimeter comes in, and that's how you get this centimeter cubed, okay, because you've multiplied centimeters times centimeters times centimeters. The unit always goes behind your measurement. So if you noticed on the data table, okay, I put centimeters behind every measurement that I did, even the average. That's because you can't just write a number, because they need to know, whoever's looking at this data needs to know what it was measured in. If you just put 14, is that 14 dogs? Is that 14 grams? Is that 14 pounds? Or, you know, what is that? Is that 14 inches? So it's super duper important to make sure that you put your units and that you understand the tool that you're going to be using to measure. Okay, so we talked about a data table. Data is always put in a data table. It's not just written randomly. Okay, and then we need to know that we're using the correct tools, and that we have the correct units, and we're measuring correctly. Okay, all right, so this should be in your notebook for your data collection and measurement notes.